Perón actively sought to recruit the escaping Nazis to come to Argentina with a very simple caveat. It wasn't just because he liked them, it was because they were paying him, and they were paying him large amounts of money, mostly in gold or jewelry, or in some cases in cash as well.
Well, and Eichmann would be a famous example of someone who took refuge in Argentina under Perón.
Absolutely. Eichmann was, of course, the best known case because everybody has been aware of what went on with the capture of Eichmann, which happened in 1960, which is why the book begins in 1960, which means that there's a connection already to the presence of Eichmann. But Eichmann was not necessarily the only the only war criminal in Argentina. There were very many notorious criminals that actually ended up in Argentina. And it is interesting, for instance, to read a little bit about what happened when Perón was in exile in Spain. He would be visited by a lot of people, and he would tell anyone who wanted to ask that he actually did receive in his suburban residence many of the Nazi criminals. So one story that is very interesting is that a very well-known Argentinian writer was once interviewing Perón while he was in exile in Spain, and Perón was telling him that yes, he had been visited by a German specialist in genetics, and that this specialist in genetics would amaze him with some of his discoveries and the work he had done. And when the writer asked Perón what was the name, first Perón pretended not to remember, and then he said, yes, I think I know his name was Gregor, Dr. Gregor. Well, what happened is that Helmut Gregor was the name in the passport that the Red Cross had given Joseph Mengele to Argentina. Right, and there's in fact some information that suggests that Mengele's name, for instance, was listed in the Buenos Aires phone book in 1956. So people were coming in, and as you saw in the trailer, they were playing their way with gold, and in fact it was so the amount of gold that they were and money they were bringing, the amount of Central Bank had grew exponentially from the war years to the post-World War II years, so that at one point Eva Perón, Evita, chartered a plane from Iberia and went to Switzerland to open an account, reportedly with the gold that they had taken for allowing the Nazis to come in. And it is known that while Perón lived in Spain later on, after he had been run away from, after his regime went down, he had about $500 million in his Swiss bank accounts. So there's a lot of information that can be accessed to create a historical platform, and therefore it's not very difficult to do that. The part that is a little bit difficult to connect is whether or not the fiction, in this case the one that I created, has any elements of truth to it.
It sounds very plausible, right? I know, for example, another angle that you play on is the looted art. There was looted gold and treasure, but there was art as well.
Right.
And an art piece is fairly identifiable. I mean,
right.
It's, you know, if it was owned by somebody at one point and it shows up somewhere else,
exactly,
we can say there's a provenance of how it got there.
Right. And
so that was a fascinating point too, I think, the art.
And that is in fact what happened, because rarely some of the pieces of art appeared in the Buenos Aires auction houses. So in the trailer you see a couple of paintings. Those are paintings by Canaletto, and in fact those appeared here and there in some of the auctions in Buenos Aires, and they were traced down to collections owned by different people in Europe, victims of war. And in this case, there was a significant collection of a dealer called Vollard, who was a French dealer that actually died in the late 30s, but some of those pieces were traced down to his collection, which had disappeared from Europe. But the whole issue of art looting and pillage it's a very complex issue that unfortunately has not found its resolution. This is a story without an end.
Well, there has been some historical work, and you draw and make mention of that in your book. But the degree to which it occurred and the degree which has been detected, I guess there's a big difference there.
Right.
And the full accounting of that is still yet to be done, which makes the premise of your story all the more plausible, I think.
Right, because you can translate some of the things that happened in Europe to plausible things that might have happened elsewhere. Unfortunately, Argentina was not the only repository of these escaping war criminals, because it was a situation that occurred in most South American countries. Brazil, Chile, just as bad as Argentina and others. Argentina was, however, particularly culpable because of Perón's interest in recruiting Nazis and, of course, in getting the money. But if you look at what happened in Europe, for instance, the art looting that took place was so frenzied, sometimes the scavenging was so frenzied that the Germans had to create special repositories to simply store it. So one of the things they did was to use one of the museums in Paris called the Jeu de Paume, which is basically a very lovely museum in some of the gardens of the Tuileries in Paris. And it's called the Jeu de Paume because that's the name of lawn tennis. So they used to play lawn tennis in this building, which they turned later on into a museum.